Well, hello, listeners. Welcome back to the Well Dwellers podcast. My name is Eric Freiberger. I'm the creator and host here at The Bottom of the Well. Today's conversation is meant to be an invitation into sacred ground where theology meets wounded bodies, where doctrine touches lived experience, and where the images of God is no longer abstract, but flesh and blood, fragile and radiant. Today, my guest, Keith Dow, works with Charis, Deeper Communion. He's involved with the Images of God project, which he'll be telling us about shortly. And his writing in Disability Theology offers a vision of Christian discipleship that is not built on strength, efficiency, or autonomy, but on vulnerability, belonging, interdependence, and love. He has written a book titled Formed Together, Mystery, Narrative, and Virtue in Christian Caregiving. And personally, as a good friend, he brings an inspirational voice to me as a model for incredible advocacy and leadership. So thanks for joining me today. Welcome, Keith.
Thanks for having me, Eric. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and thanks for the kind introduction as well.
Yeah. So you're coming from Ontario, assuming you're there, because I know you travel lots.
Yeah, that's right. I'm just south of Ottawa, Ontario.
Okay, how's the weather today?
You know, it was beautiful. It looks like we're maybe finally coming out of winter. We had a dump of snow in the last couple of days, so it's just melting again. It kind of teases us and then goes away again. So hopefully it's going away for good soon.
Okay. We had a bit of snow the other day too, but we're on an upturn. So we should be hitting plus teen temperatures by tomorrow. So
Nice.
Hopefully I'll get out and start some wheeling. So, just a little fun here. What are you looking forward to most as spring is arriving?
Yeah, I'm pretty excited, honestly, just for being in a hammock again. I think being in a hammock is one of my favorite places when it's sunny out and you can hear the birds chirping and just being outside and having friends and family around. We have a nice campfire area out back too, so we love having people over and just talking around the fire.
It's been a long time since I've been in a hammock, but I used to like them when I was a kid. So I'm assuming a good book goes along with that.
Often, yeah, and sometimes a good book turns into a nap, but it's all good.
What are you reading these days?
So I actually, we're recording this just after Easter, and I just started diving into Surprised by Hope by N.T. Wright. I don't know if you've read it before, but it's an important challenge for us, kind of about what Jesus' resurrection is really about and what it calls us to in terms of the here and now, and not just the by and by, if you will.
Yeah, I have read it, actually. It's been a few years, but N.T. Wright is quite a brilliant writer.
Yeah, and he has a way, as we're talking about accessibility and disability and those kinds of things, he has a way of writing to people where they're at, which I really appreciate. Just, he has some really profound things that he says and great words that he uses, but he also has a way of just connecting with people kind of wherever they're coming from.
Yeah, he does. Well, speaking of disability and advocacy, I'm kind of curious, what started you down that road of advocating for disabled people?
Well, it's a great question. So I was studying philosophy here in Ottawa, a little college called Dominican University College, and so it was a school kind of run by Dominican brothers, and I enjoyed the learning. I enjoyed studying the history of philosophy. But there often seemed to be something missing along the way, that we would be, unpacking these great ideas from the past, but so often they seem not to land, right? In terms of the people would be thinking about them, but maybe not acting them out, maybe not living them out in different ways. And so I came to a certain point, and really through the writing of Soren Kierkegaard, who talks about the importance of Christ as a pattern and kind of living into what we're called to, and not using cleverness as a way of evading Christ's demand on our lives. And I found that really challenging and convicting. And so I was looking kind of for a way to live out my faith. And then I had a colleague for many years who came to me, and then she was part of my church and said, "Hey, Keith, I think that this would be a good fit for you to work at what was then Christian Horizons at the time, now Caris Disability Services." And honestly, I'd never really considered disability services as a career path. And so I think there's a lot of misperceptions around it as well, that you need to be somehow extra, I don't know, extra holy or extra good or extra and whatever it is. But really, it's just a matter of human beings coming alongside human beings and supporting each other in different ways. But it really needed that invitation to step into that world. And when I did, I worked for several years as a direct support provider. It was just transformative for me in terms of, being able to see my gifts used in ways that were meaningful, but also having my own life shaped and transformed by getting to know the people that I was working with and supporting. And so I found with my life, it's often kind of reciprocal in terms of the theoretical side and the practical side. So I've shared how I was studying philosophy and then entering into a practical field. And then, I stepped into other roles down the road from that, but that then shaped my writing. You talked about Formed Together, and Formed Together is really around the shared stories that came out of that time, together with further reflection. And Kierkegaard makes an appearance there as well, comes back into the discussions of, if we are to take each other seriously as, we're going to be talking a bit about being made in God's image, right? How has so much of philosophy and theology at times just had these presuppositions about what it means to be made in God's image? And the folks that I was working with and supporting didn't have the same kinds of cognitive abilities that I had, but it was undeniable that we were shaped and changed by each other, and that they represented God to me in different ways, and I represented God to them in different ways as well. So we were learning from each other kind of through those processes. And so basically the whole book, which is built on my PhD dissertation, is out of the sense of what would theological ethics look like if we took the lived experience of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and the shaping of our Christian culture, if you will, our communities, our churches, if you took that seriously and kind of rebuilt care ethics around that as a serious starting point. So maybe just a little example of that, how so many philosophies kind of depend on knowing what is going on, just to put it really simply, is knowing what somebody's intention is with a certain action, or knowing what kind of philosophy or theology drives what they're doing, right? And so often these approaches say you need to understand all that in order to know whether something is right or wrong, in order to know basically how to judge that. And my posture here in this book is more like, we never have that degree of understanding, like whether or not you have a cognitive intellectual disability. We often don't understand ourselves and where we're coming from and why we do the things we do, let alone those around us. But we're so often quick to jump in and judge and say, this is right, this is wrong. And so taking that seriously, taking that limit of, I don't understand myself very well, I don't understand you very well, potentially. And frankly, often I don't understand God very well. And so what is the ethical disposition? What are the ways we should be interacting and working with each other and supporting one another, if that is our reality, rather than this position of kind of understanding all the philosophical traditions and knowing where people are coming from and knowing whether actions are right or wrong. And it's not to minimize. I think there are times and places to say, yeah, that's right, yeah, that's wrong. That we do know these things, but it's almost a counter position to help make sense of those times when we just don't know what's going on in the way that we sometimes think that we do.
I know you mentioned about caregiving here a little bit in your description of the book, and I guess one of the things I first see is a lot of times when people talk about caregiving and the disabled community, it's often about those who are caring for disabled people. And I was just sort of wondering if your approach or your understanding, is it seeing that caregiving is a mutual experience, a mutual relationship, that not only are you offering care for those with intellectual disabilities and other disabilities, but that you're also receiving care from that community.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And care itself is a complicated concept and word and experience, and the roots of it actually come from the sense of grief, right? And so we think of care in one way today as kind of the provision of care, perhaps for one another, caregiving, but at its roots is kind of this shared grief or experience that we have with one another, and I appreciate that the way that understanding it in that sense kind of unsettles the notion of care, right? That when you enter into each other's lives, there are these griefs, there are these ways of kind of carrying one another's burdens, right? And that's if it's done with a kind of humanity, then it's always mutual in some way. So Henry Nouwen said that true care is mutual care. And that's something that stuck with me. Now, Nouwen had his own kind of interesting approaches when he talks about supporting Adam. And so you talked about how care is often from the perspective of those providing care. Nouwen was that in a way that he's looked to as a pretty significant figure in caregiving and theology. But the way that he writes sometimes really privileges Adam in almost this supernatural way, like seeing him as the image of Christ in his life, and the ways Adam relates to him are transformative for Nouwen. And so I don't want to deny Nouwen's experience of that. Like, I truly believe that Nouwen was changed and transformed in his relationship with Adam. At the same time, we want to be careful that we don't set anybody up, whether it's anybody in a care relationship, as being kind of the holier than thou person. And I think sometimes it's easy to do. And I mentioned in my own journey how early on I had this conception that people that were involved in that kind of care were, better than me in some way, or had some special gift that I didn't have. So it's complicated. I think it's important to recognize the impact that we have on each other and the interdependence of care relationships in some way, without super privileging kind of either person in that kind of a relationship.
Henry Nouwen, of course, very, very well-known theologian, and I've read a few of his books too, and I think he has this way of articulating that this mutual care relationship also opens him to hearing, I'm ad-libbing here, but hearing the voice of God speaking into his life through the people that he's caring for, through Adam and others. That a lot of those theological insights in that come from that care that is mutually experienced. And I kind of wonder, in your own work and activities, as you've been involved with many people relationally as well, I would love to hear some stories, how you may have encountered God speaking into your life through these relationships.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of, and I don't want to pretend either that these only happen kind of in relationships between disabled and non-disabled people or that kind of context, but to acknowledge that it happens in all of our human interactions in different ways. But I think particularly when there are maybe differences there that challenge us or disrupt us or force us to come face to face with ourselves in a new way. And there's one gentleman that I supported many years ago, and he would often have kind of difficulty with his stomach problems that could be quite pronounced, but he didn't have a way of expressing that. I shouldn't say that. He had many ways of expressing that. He wasn't able to express that through English. or through verbal language, if you will. And so sometimes it's difficult to tell kind of what was going on, and we needed to work with him, bring him to a hospital or have doctors come in and work with him. But understandably, when you're not sure what's going on and you're in pain, that can cause different kinds of behavioral reactions. And so there was a certain danger in those connection points at different times. There was one instance where it was particularly bad, and we ended up bringing him into the hospital, but the hospital room wasn't set up well to kind of accommodate him to be a space that, for instance, sometimes it's helpful to take sharp objects out of the way, or it's right when you want to be conscious of somebody's environment in terms of things that could be used as a weapon or thrown or what have you. And so my colleague had stepped out of the room, and I was left alone in supporting him, which, in hindsight was not a good idea. We thought that he was kind of down and sleeping or out of it, and he ended up getting up and kind of coming at me, I guess. And there's been several times like this, but that was one particularly intense time where I was very mindful of, sharp objects over here or medical equipment over there that could be damaged, or, what might happen. And when someone isn't sure what's going on and you feel trapped in a hospital room, obviously there's a lot of confusion, and you just want to get out of there. So I had a lot of training in nonviolent crisis intervention and those kinds of safety protocols to help these things happen well. But in that moment, you're kind of confronted with another human being who is in pain, and the actions of this gentleman were potentially dangerous. And you find yourself kind of locked with each other, trying to protect yourself at the same time, trying to protect this man from potentially self-injurious behavior as well, and keep him away from some of these objects that could cause pretty significant damage. So there's a lot going on. And, some of that training kicks in at that point. But at the same time, some of it is you're making it up as you go along. Like, how do I accommodate this and really respond to this person who's in front of me? And I think in my work, some of that writing around Emmanuel Levinas and the face of the other, he talks about the face of the other kind of being like the face of God in a way in your encounter with another person, and how there's this command. He goes straight for the command of, like, thou shalt not kill, kind of emanating from the interaction in the encounter. But that's kind of a stand-in for the whole ethical apparatus. And I think in some of those situations where you are doing your best to really love and protect somebody else who is coming at you, but is also coming at you in a sense of, like, almost help me to understand this, Keith. Help me to understand what is happening here, what is going on. Like, it almost is this picture of wrestling with each other as Jacob wrestled with the angel. And I think some of those really intense situations drive home for me that even in these circumstances that are beyond our control, and where there's potentially some fear, there's at least a heightened sense of anxiety, and how is this going to work out, and how do I, even those pieces around how do I fulfill my job well in this moment. But underneath all that is a sense of, I am here with another human being who is created in God's image. And there's a sense that the whole ethical encounter comes down to those moments. And we may not always recognize it, right? If you're, at the cashier at a grocery store or something, you might not enter into the profundity of this person is created in God's image. But I think it's always there, right? And so there's an aspect of the recognition of it, right? The kind of theological understanding side of it, of, yeah, I can put some words to this and describe what's happening in a theological way or a philosophical way, if you will. But that always comes after the fact of these encounters with one another, kind of as a human another. Thankfully, my colleague came back, and we were able to support the person well, to find some pain relief and to kind of get healthy again. But but it's those kinds of moments, right? That you often feel like I'm not prepared for this. Even my training, I have some training here, but it never provides everything that you need. So in those moments, as human beings encountering each other, we need a kind of posture towards each other that is going to respect and honor the other person as created in God's image, and even trust in a way that there's that kind of respect and recognition back in a sense. And I did feel it even in those moments. That, like I said, it's almost a kind of dancing alongside this weird kind of wrestling of trying to protect somebody from themselves and trying to protect yourself at the same time. That there's a desire to connect with each other to help try to make sense of the world together.
There's a couple key words sticking out in my thoughts here from you sharing this story about this young man, and one of them is the idea of holiness. You talked earlier about those that would care for certain individuals who seem to be holier, and you also talked about posture, and I'm kind of putting the two together of, when we approach our relationships with one another, respecting the image of God and one another, we want to take a posture of holiness, but a holiness that extends beyond just the self-perception or the perception of others. Rather, that's a holiness we share in. That whole story about this young man in the hospital also kind of paints this picture of holiness being in the midst of not only chaos, but messiness.
Yeah.
And a bit of pain and suffering, I'm sure, too. And I'm just wondering if we expanded and went further down that, is there something more we can see in that posture of holiness amidst that chaos? Ways that we can recognize those moments as being holy. How can we share that and help others to see that in the midst of those moments?
That's a great question. I mean, I often come back to this sense of disruption. Judith Butler talks about this disruption of the norms that govern recognition. And I found that a helpful phrase, disruption in the norms that govern recognition. I might find myself in situations like this one where you feel out of your depths, where you feel out of those norms that, like, this is how small talk works, right? I say, hey, nice weather outside. You say, right, whatever it is, that we have these kinds of social constructs that we know how to interact, right? It works well for us. That's fully within the norms that govern recognition. But when there's a disruption of those types of encounters, then we're forced to really make it up as we go along. But what you mentioned, the word holiness, I mean, holiness gets this sense of being set apart, right? And that's the otherness of each other. So I think a piece of it is whenever we are getting to know someone, whenever we're meeting somebody, recognizing the otherness of this other. We could talk here about stigma and all of the presuppositions that can come in when there are certain embodied realities to a person that might kind of prompt these, again, presuppositions about who they are or what they're about or what they do. We need more of a curiosity in those spaces to say there is a certain holiness here. There's a certain otherness here that I need to enter into in a different way, that I need to be bringing questions. And these are often deeply human questions. One example is, Amy Kenny's book, My Body is Not a Prayer Request, right? And I love even the title of it, where she's kind of riffing on the sense that people will come up to her using a wheelchair and see that as an invitation to prayer, and not with a kind of curiosity about, hey, what can I pray for you about today? But again, these preset ideas of, if I found myself in that situation, I would want somebody to come and pray for me to be quote unquote healed, to be able to not use a wheelchair anymore. And so bringing all that into that space. And so what does that look like if instead we had a posture of this person is holy, this person is set apart, this person is other? What does it look like to enter into their world and discover who God is calling them to be? And I think what's also helpful about that is it turns the question back on ourselves, right? Because so often we can think, oh yeah, I am this person, and that can be good or bad, right? It can be, I'm the best in the world, I'm so smart, I'm whatever. Or it can be like, oh, what a worm am I? Like this is, I have nothing good, nothing good to bring to this space, if you will. In in either sense, in all of these senses, we need that kind of disruption of others when we get to know each other to say, either I see more in you than this grand ideal that you are sharing about who you are. Even that can sometimes be a front if we come in and say all these great things. It can be a front for the insecurities. So sometimes we need people to tear down those walls and say, hey, I think this is an area that maybe you could work on, or the opposite way where we feel like, oh, I don't really have anything to bring to the space. We need people to get to know us and to start calling out those gifts of, yeah, you don't have maybe a recognized flashy role here, but I just really appreciate the kind of quiet joy you bring into our community. Or it might be something practical, like the way that you show up on time every week and just make sure this certain thing happens as part of our community. Like it doesn't go unnoticed that we see you, we're grateful for you, and we're grateful for who God has made you to be in the contribution that you have here.
Yeah, that's really good. I'm kind of also thinking along the lines when it comes to curiosity. And I know you talk a lot about discipleship as well, and it's kind of a common theme amongst most Christian communities. Discipleship usually is focused and intent on kind of that intellectual aspect. Are you taking part in Bible studies? Are you reading good theological content? And although I love those things myself, I have often found myself curious on how we can disciple with an with a I don't know if this is the right word, ontological.
I like it. I don't know what it means, but
with an intent of expanding the mind and the understanding and the meanings for those with cognitive disabilities, but also bridging that relationship with those who are disabled who may not be cognitively disabled, so that intellect becomes something bigger, again, like we were saying, posture-wise, that is shared and helps the whole community as a whole grow in deeper relationship with God and understanding who He is in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the greatest crimes of the modern day church is the ways that we have limited, and we were talking about gifts and contribution before, limited the gifts and contributions of disciples in our walls, in our communities, due to kind of this, and you touched on this, like the hypercognitive draw, right? If somebody has this intellectual ability to say things well, then we put them on a pulpit, we bring them up front. There's a few kind of recognized gifts, right? And thankfully music is a piece of that as well. But because maybe it's partly because we love order so much, it seems, and we're cautious about disruption. We don't look for the opportunity in disruption, but many churches are not looking to try new things and embracing the contribution of everybody. And I frame it that way deliberately because there are a lot of people who might be very intelligent from, kind of a standard way of looking at it, who are not really into theology, who have different ways of expressing themselves. So they might be hard workers, they might be artistic in different ways, right? That we all have these multifaceted aspects to who we are. But because we privilege cognitive abilities and articulation and those pieces, I think we demean the gifts of so many people, right? And that's a piece of why I started the Images of God project. So if we're okay to go into that a little bit, there was a call for applications for this fellowship. And the call said that they were looking to better understand how people conceive of and think about divine realities. And I found that fascinating. Like I find, so this was a psychology cross training for theologians. So as a theologian, I'm always fascinated by psychology and the intersection with our lives and our minds in that way. And so I said, how people conceive of and think about divine realities. That's a pretty cognitively heavy application process, and understandably so. I mean, it's psychology of religion. But I talked with folks at Charis and I submitted a proposal that was really kind of turning it on its head to say, we need to look at ways to include the voices and perspectives of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, even in that research process, to understand how people conceive of and think about divine realities. And thankfully, the folks at University of Birmingham, and this is connected with the John Templeton Foundation, saw the value in that, right? And so that that kind of opened up this whole world of how do we engage accessible arts-based approaches to hear from one another in terms of our understanding of God. And there were a few tools. I mean, we don't have to get into them in depth. Maybe they'll pop up, but there are a few different methods that were already kind of established around showing people pictures and asking them, how much does this remind you of God? Or photo voice is a process that's used in many communities where people can take pictures and then whether it's journal about them or talk about them or reflect on them in some way to communicate what they're interested in or the change that they want to see. And so in this case, it was like, how do these pictures of the world around you remind you of God? So I worked with 11 Christian adults with intellectual disabilities in Ontario, and it was just really profound kind of coming alongside them and learning from them through this process, and then having the opportunity to share their insights back with the Birmingham team, with psychology of religion folks and science engaged theology folks. And the way that people are providing feedback on it, I think it's been pretty meaningful for others as well.
Yeah, that's kind of where one of the things I really loved about your work last year when Deeper Communion had the Ontario conference, and you shared quite in depth on your work with Images of God and the connection with culture and art, something I'm passionate about and love. I grew up in a home that was very artistic musically, made sure that I was involved with a lot of different cultural groups when I was younger. And I guess now, I especially seem to see God at work and speaking and showing up through different cultural avenues and not just the church.
Right.
So, and I think my listeners know from previous episodes on Star Trek and an upcoming episode on Star Wars that, sci-fi is a passion of mine too. But I guess one of the things I'm curious about and wondering is a lot of times I know there's the challenge of how there's the fear that the church is becoming more a cultural reflection than it is a reflection of the image of God. And I think we could do that probably individually too, where people feel they are, that there are certain people that reflect more of the culture around them than they do the actual discipling image of God that they should be focused on. So how does your work with Images of God project maybe keep the focus on God while engaging the greater culture and being creative and adventurous and maybe even provocatively dangerous at times? Yeah. How do you keep those two in play and balance?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I'm considering culture, like there's so many different aspects to what that means, and we touched on norms that govern recognition before, or normativity, or the cult of normalcy, as Thomas Reynolds talks about. And there are norms in church cultures, there are norms in societal cultures. And I think too often we look at the surface level representation of that, right? That there can be this assumption that church culture is distinctly Christian, when in many ways it follows maybe some of the deeper principles of the world that remain unquestioned, right? And so in talking about disability and accessibility and disruption that comes through that, when you have people show up at a church and they're not able to get to the door, right, because the stairs are not a ramp, or they're making noise during the service and the whole thing falls apart because of that, right? Like people make noises, right? Then one of the beauties or tragedies of that is that it can really bring to light what is the actual culture here. So you might have a very Christianese culture in terms of the words being used and all of the lingo, but it can bring to the surface these norms of, no, our top priority here is order, right? Our top priority here is that people have an hour and 20 minute, an hour experience that never varies, that they know what to expect, that they can get out on time, and that they don't experience that form of disruption. Well, to me, I mean, there's a certain value in predictability, obviously, but if those are our primary values, then we have a real problem when we look at the ways that God interacted through history, right? And the kinds of disruption that were created through his encounters with his people. So when I look at the Images of God project, a piece of it was to rock the boat a little bit when it came to research methodology, for example. So there's a lot of norms around how you gather data. And frankly, some of it comes about as a result of efficiency, right? So if you talking about cultural values, and I think that the church and nonprofits and others fall into this trap as well, kind of the seeing efficiency as a moral good in itself or moral value in itself. But so often, efficiency means that you do things the way that they've been done before because they're tried and true, right? So I do a survey online. I go through this process. When I go through the research ethics board, I have the forms that they've always used, and it's much easier just to fill them out, submit them, do everything like they're expected to be, and then you have efficiency, right? You're moving through the process pretty well. But when you're looking for accessibility, when you're looking to welcome a wider range of people into those spaces, when you're looking to engage art, which is pretty nuanced and not easy to do a really solid graph of where everybody lands in artistic representation, then it decreases your efficiency. And thankfully, the people that I worked alongside, so Martin Luther University College in Waterloo, Ontario, were the ones that had the research ethics board that I worked with. It took longer. It was more work, but they understood the importance of kind of driving that process forward in a way that was going to welcome the voices of a larger range of people. And that meant plain language consent forms, for example. That meant conversations and video calls to make sure people understood what they were getting themselves into and what they wanted to be a part of. So I guess when it comes to culture, I don't just ask what's the presenting culture, but what are those values that underlie the culture? And you may have a presenting culture like a church community that actually embody some of these very anti-biblical, almost anti-Christian values. And I'm not saying that people intend them that way or intend to push forward in that way, but they kind of get absorbed as the waters that we're swimming in and go unquestioned, or people maybe aren't always brave enough to say, hey, what does it look like to have an arts-based service, for example? What does it look like to get some paint on the floor of the sanctuary? What does it look like to maybe tear down that wall, or maybe have our service outside so that people can encounter God in a way that they're not used to? And we can reflect on that, and it can go potentially horribly, right? But we'll learn things. And as long as we're committed to one another, as long as we have that posture of mutual care, then we're going to get through this. And chances are our relationship with each other and with God are going to be stronger as a result.
I am so tempted to go down that line of reconciliation and the conversation of the reconciliation amongst people of difference in that cultural avenue. But I also know we are pressed for time, so I might have to ask you to come back to the well sometime. I do want to talk about the Banquet of Belonging, of course, coming up on May 6th and 7th here in Calgary, May 7th in Toronto, and in Langley, BC. I am really excited for this, Keith, and you are a big part of that excitement, as I know you put a lot of work into this. You helped shape the vision for the Banquet of Belonging. And I'd love to hear a bit of your thoughts as to what your vision is for this year's Deeper Communion National Conference, the Banquet of Belonging.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And, so grateful for the work that you're doing as well to bring this to your community. And so exciting to be in 4/5 places. We have a watch party happening in Windsor as well. So I'm joining in Winnipeg, and we'll be presenting on the images of God there on the 7th. And then we have Langley and Calgary and Toronto as well. And it's exciting to see this kind of come to be what it is. That I think it was 2018 or so that we kind of started with this vision of what does it look like to bring academics and practitioners and people with lived experience all together kind of to wrestle through these things. And I'm actually going to go back to, when I was talking about studying philosophy and then seeing it not land in the real world, right? And how do you bring those things together? So I think that was part of the initial vision for this. Is it's not enough to be studying these things. Theologians and academics need to see how this lands with people in the pews and people in the pulpits and vice versa, right? That these ideas that are being shared maybe more in academic circles need to impact and influence the ways that our communities happen. And we've seen a lot of that, a lot of good work happening down in the United States, for example, but we know that Canada has a distinctive kind of context. Some of that for the good, some of that maybe more challenging in this space. But it's so exciting for me to kind of draw together with other Canadians, other Canadian Christians to have these conversations. And it's never easy. I think we've seen that, especially when we want to draw together around this focus of how do our communities become places of belonging for all people, and how is that the priority here? But again, that kind of disruption and hearing from different perspectives, different people with different experiences is just so powerful. And we don't have really big names kind of sharing things, but I am like you, I am very excited for those that we do have sharing. And I know that each of our keynotes and each of our workshop presenters just has such incredible things to share. And then for me as well, again, just building that community of people who have a vision for a different way of doing life together and challenging some of these, both the preconceptions and maybe some of those societal values that creep into our church spaces as well. It's just an exciting time, and you kind of get this sense of, oh, I thought I was alone in thinking this way, or I thought I was doing this work by myself, but I'm not. And there's great people all across the country who are striving for this together.
That's amazing. Yes, I'm hoping we can draw in a lot of church leadership and pastors into our conversation, as I think it's important for them to hear that vision too. Keith, I want to thank you for joining me today. I want to leave a little bit of final word for our listeners, a bit of my last thoughts. My hope is that we become communities where dignity is not conditional, ability is not worshipped, productivity is not sacred, efficiency is not divine. I'm hoping we become people who believe that interdependence is holy, that vulnerability is wisdom, disability is not the absence of the image of God, it is one of its clearest revelations of it. Keith, this has been an awesome conversation. I hope I didn't throw you too many curveballs.
It's been great.
Yeah, thank you for being with me here in the Well Dwellers podcast.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I really enjoyed our conversation today too.